All right, so today we are diving into a pretty intense topic, Islamic extremism,
Hmm.
and we're looking at it through the lens of JihadWatch.
Okay.
We've got a whole stack of articles here from today,
All right.
October 7th, and wow, there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about stuff happening in the U.S., Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Nigeria, Iran,
Wow.
even Germany, UK, France, India, you name it.
Global.
It really underscores how this is not just that part of the world problem.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's a global issue.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right, how these geographically diverse events, they all kind of seem to come together around this idea of jihad
They do.
and how people interpret that.
And speaking of jihad, today happens to be the
Right.
one-year anniversary of that attack on Israel by Hamas that they call the Al-Aqsa flood operation.
Right, right.
And JihadWatch points out how Iranian leader Khamenei is using this anniversary to kind of, well, taunt Israel.
Yeah.
Basically saying that it set the Zionist regime back 70 years.
I mean, it's just a very stark reminder that for some, this anniversary isn't about, like, reflecting or trying to move towards peace.
Right.
It's a victory
Yeah.
for this extremist ideology.
And it gets even more unsettling when JihadWatch
That-
points to this statistic,
Okay.
that 39% of U.S. Muslims say that Hamas, quote, did not commit murder and rape during the attack.
Wow.
That's a significant number.
Yeah.
And it really makes you think about how differently people are viewing this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your initial thoughts on that?
I think it's a good example of how things aren't so black and white,
Right.
especially in charged situations like this.
Well, and it just makes you realize how important it is to, like you said, not just jump to conclusions,
Right.
but to really try to understand what's behind those viewpoints.
Absolutely.
Why do people think that way? Is it
Yeah.
misinformation? Do they just have a completely different understanding of what happened?
It reminds me of that quote, like, everyone's fighting a battle you know nothing about.
Right, exactly.
So be kind, always.
Compassion, always.
But kind of shifting gears here a little bit.
Okay.
JihadWatch also points to the treatment of religious minorities in Iran,
Okay.
specifically Christians and Baha'is.
And this is where you tend to see those clashes of values,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to freedom of religion.
And they point to a specific example.
Okay.
This guy, Alexander B.,
Okay.
who's in his late 70s.
Yeah.
And he was imprisoned for, get this, attracting Muslims
Yeah.
because he was handing out Christian materials.
Oversight.
Yeah. So it's like in a place where one religion holds all the power.
Right.
Even what we might consider a pretty standard act of religious expression
Solely.
is seen as a threat.
Wow. That's a really stark contrast to, the freedoms that many of us are used to.
Totally.
And it makes you think, what are the limits of religious freedom, especially for minority groups?
And they go on to talk about an 80-year-old Baha'i man who was jailed for, quote, disrupting national security.
Wow.
Simply because of his faith. So it's like this is a recurring theme in these articles.
Oh, yeah. It really underscores that, this isn't just an abstract concept like suppression of minority faiths. This is real.
Right.
And it impacts people's lives in really significant ways.
It's a good reminder to not take that lightly.
Absolutely.
Now, taking a look at something else here, JihadWatch is also really critical of Western media.
Okay.
And they're basically saying that the media often downplays or even completely ignores any connection between Islam and violence.
And that's an important critique to consider.
Yeah.
Now, we should acknowledge that JihadWatch definitely has a particular point of view.
Right.
But this idea that there might be some bias in how the media reports on these things, that's worth looking into.
They talk about how CBS put out a report about a woman who was rescued in Gaza, but they left out the part where she was actually an ISIS sex slave.
Oh, wow.
They just said she was, quote, stranded.
Wow.
They also criticize how celebrations of the October 7th terror attacks are often portrayed as just like pro-Palestinian rallies.
Interesting.
It's like they're choosing to focus on certain narratives.
Right. It really makes you think about how we present information, doesn't it? And how important it is to be accurate and avoid harmful stereotypes. But at the same time, we can't just leave out critical context.
Exactly. Like, what else are we missing?
Right. Exactly.
And kind of on that note, JihadWatch doesn't hold back when they share some really disturbing stories about violence
Okay.
and oppression that they say are justified in the name of Islamic law.
And this is where it's so crucial to understand what jihad actually means, because it's a term that's so often misunderstood and misused, especially in the West.
They share this really chilling story from Nigeria
Okay.
about a man whose own family tried to kill him because he converted to Christianity. And that really highlights the danger for people who choose to leave Islam.
It's a serious issue, even today.
Yeah,
This idea of apostasy, renouncing your religion,
right.
it can have very real and very dangerous consequences in some parts of the world.
And you see this violence being justified under the banner of jihad.
Right.
But JihadWatch is saying that this term is often misinterpreted.
Well, yeah, because, the word jihad in its purest form,
Right.
it's about an internal struggle, right?
Mhm.
It's like a striving for self-improvement.
Right.
But like a lot of religious concepts, it can be interpreted in different ways.
Right.
And unfortunately, extremist groups have twisted it
Right.
to fit their own agenda of violence and terror.
So how do we unpack all of that?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it starts with education, honestly.
Okay.
We have to go beyond these simple and often fear-based narratives
Right.
and really delve into the complexity of Islamic theology and history.
Look past the headlines.
Exactly.
It reminds me of that saying, like, don't judge a book by its cover.
Exactly.
There's always more to the story.
Always.
And sometimes those deeper layers can be very disturbing.
Yeah.
Like this story that JihadWatch shared about a Hindu couple in India.
Okay.
They were robbed and then pressured to convert to Islam
Oh, wow.
under the guise of a, get this, exorcism.
Seriously.
And that just shows how complex this issue of forced conversion can be.
Yeah, it's using coercion and intimidation
Right.
to force someone to abandon their faith.
Yeah.
And that strikes at the core of what religious freedom is all about.
It's denying someone that fundamental right to choose their own beliefs.
Exactly. It's a violation.
No. Wow. It's heavy stuff.
It is. Yeah,
And it's a lot to think about.
absolutely.
Yeah, it really makes you realize, like, these issues, they affect real people.
Absolutely.
It's not just headlines, you know?
Right. There are actual human beings behind these stories.
Yeah, and their lives are being turned upside down.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because JihadWatch argues that this kind of religious intolerance,
Mm-hmm.
it can pop up in places you wouldn't expect.
Okay.
Like they brought up this case in Germany,
Okay.
which, let's face it, has a complicated history with intolerance.
Yeah, no doubt.
They've really tried to confront their past.
They have.
But this case kind of shows that those tensions are still there.
Simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly.
Wow.
So they talk about this Jewish father and daughter
Okay.
who were brutally attacked.
Oh, my God.
And witnesses are saying that the attackers were mostly Muslim migrants
Wow.
protesting in support of Hamas.
That's heavy.
It really shows how anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
it's not just a thing of the past, unfortunately.
No, it's still a very real threat.
Yeah, and it's especially concerning that this happened in Germany.
Right.
They've worked so hard
They really have.
to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening again after the Holocaust.
Exactly. So to see this kind of violence erupt again
Right.
in a different context, it's very troubling.
What's going on here?
Right? It makes you wonder
Yeah.
what's driving these events.
And on that note,
Yeah.
JihadWatch also calls out Turkish President Erdogan for recently comparing the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to Hitler.
Oh, boy. Yeah,
I mean,
it's not only historically inaccurate,
right.
but it's incredibly offensive.
Yeah.
And it's a classic example of using anti-Semitic tropes to demonize Israel.
Right. It's like they're digging into the past
Yeah,
and using these loaded comparisons to stir up trouble in the present.
absolutely. Trying to inflame those tensions.
And it's not just coming from politicians either.
Really.
JihadWatch tells this story about a student at UPenn,
Okay.
the University of Pennsylvania,
Okay.
who, get this, faced zero consequences for calling the Hamas attack glorious
Wow.
and joyful just days after it happened.
This was a year ago.
Yeah, and according to JihadWatch,
Okay.
she's still on campus.
Wow, that raises questions, right?
It does.
About where's the line with free speech,
Right.
especially on a college campus.
Right, because on the one hand, universities should be places where people can openly discuss and debate different ideas.
Of course.
But on the other hand, there's a big difference between sharing your opinion and encouraging violence or hate.
Absolutely. Finding that balance is tough.
Speaking of blurred lines,
Yeah.
JihadWatch also criticizes how those October 7th attack celebrations are often painted by the media as just
Mhm.
pro-Palestinian rallies.
Right, right.
They even quote a headline from the Associated Press as an example.
And this gets to the heart of their whole argument about media bias, right? I mean, there are definitely many people who support the Palestinian cause peacefully
Yeah.
and who condemn violence.
Of course.
But when you label events where people are openly supporting terrorist attacks
Right.
as simply pro-Palestinian rallies,
Right.
you kind of downplay the fact that there are extremist viewpoints present.
It's like they're sanitizing the story.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you avoid those hard truths, are you really getting the full picture?
That's always the risk.
Right.
When you shy away from the complexity.
It's like that quote, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off."
Right. Exactly.
So you really have to be willing to dig deep.
Absolutely.
Engage with different sources.
You have helpful perspectives and be a
critical thinker.
especially with something as emotionally charged as this conflict. It's crucial.
Now, on a related note, JihadWatch also talks about some disturbing cases of violence against women, particularly in the UK and France.
Right.
And they link these cases to how some people interpret Islamic teachings.
Okay, and I think it's really important here to tread carefully.
Of course.
And avoid making sweeping generalizations.
Of course, but they do make some interesting points. Like they brought up this case of Mohammed Ido, who was accused of raping a woman to death in West London.
Oh, gosh.
And then there was this other case in Paris where 4 Muslim migrants were arrested for sexually assaulting tourists.
Wow.
And in both cases, JihadWatch is drawing connections to these Islamic teachings about how to treat infidels.
Right, and those are horrific crimes.
They are.
And I can see why they would make that connection.
Yeah.
I mean, there are definitely aspects of Islamic law.
Right.
Particularly how it's interpreted by extremist groups.
Right.
That condone violence against women and non-believers.
It's just terrifying to think that these old, brutal beliefs are still being used to justify violence today.
It really is. And it underscores how important it is to challenge and push back against those extremist ideologies.
Absolutely.
Wherever they pop up.
But it's also important to remember
that
this doesn't represent the views of all Muslims.
Absolutely. It's about condemning the actions of the few.
Right.
Without condemning an entire faith.
It's like that saying, to hate all because of the few is just as bad.
Exactly.
You got to fight hate with understanding, not more hate.
I love that. That's powerful.
JihadWatch also talks about these Islamic preachers who were praising the October 7th attack.
Really?
Which is really concerning.
Yeah.
They point to this one guy, Ala Jabir.
Okay.
He's an Islamic scholar from Jordan.
Okay.
And he called the Hamas incursion a holy and glorious crossing.
See, that's dangerous because when you have religious leaders openly praising these acts of terrorism, it can really legitimize violence.
Yeah.
Especially for their followers.
Yeah, those who might already be vulnerable.
Exactly. It's scary.
It's like they're using their position of power to encourage more violence and hatred.
Exactly, which is why we need those voices of peace and reason speaking out against that kind of rhetoric.
We need to hear those voices more than ever.
More than ever.
So shifting gears a bit.
Okay.
JihadWatch also gets into the whole Israel-Hezbollah conflict in Lebanon.
Right. Which is such a complex situation.
It is.
It really shows just how deep those tensions run in the Middle East.
It really does. And things are heating up over there.
Yeah.
Like, Israel recently bombed what they're calling a Hezbollah command center that was inside a mosque.
Wow.
Which raises these really complicated questions
about
the rules of war.
Yeah, like, on the one hand, using a place of worship for military purposes.
Yeah.
It's against international law.
Right.
But then again, when you attack a place of worship,
you're putting civilians at risk.
Exactly. It's a no-win situation.
It feels like it. Like, how do you even begin to target military objectives in civilian areas without hurting innocent people?
Right. I mean, it's a challenge that military strategists face all over the world. Yeah. And there are no easy answers.
It's just a stark reminder of how awful war is.
It is.
And how innocent lives are always at stake.
Always.
No matter what side you're on.
Yeah, heartbreaking.
So JihadWatch also gives us some insight into this situation in India.
Okay.
Where this Muslim man was found guilty of giving money to jihadist terrorism.
Wow.
And now he's saying he's embraced, quote, Gandhian ways.
Really?
Trying to get the ban on his organization lifted.
So it makes you wonder, is he being genuine?
Right.
Has he really changed his ways?
Or is this just a way to get what he wants?
Right. It's really hard to know for sure.
It is, and it reminds you to be careful about just accepting what you hear at face value.
Exactly. especially when it comes to someone with a history of extremism.
Especially in these situations.
Exactly. You got to be cautious.
And speaking of complicated situations, JihadWatch also talks about the whole debate over whether Israel should strike Iran's nuclear facilities.
Right. That's a tense one.
It is.
It's been a major source of anxiety for the international community.
And for good reason.
Right. Iran's nuclear program has had Israel and its allies on edge for years now.
And those worries are getting worse.
Yeah.
Especially with Iran enriching uranium beyond the limits they agreed to in that 2015 nuclear deal.
Right. It's a delicate situation for sure.
It feels like one of those situations where any move could have huge consequences.
It could set off a much bigger conflict.
It's like we're at a tipping point.
It really is.
We need to prioritize diplomacy and dialogue now more than ever.
I completely agree. Finding a peaceful solution has to be the top priority.
Because the alternative is just unthinkable. It really is. Yeah, it's a scary thought.
It's like working on the edge of a cliff.
It makes you realize how interconnected everything is and how serious these conflicts really are.
Yeah, it makes you want to bury your head in the sand.
Right.
But it's so important to stay informed.
Absolutely.
And to understand what's going on in the world.
Knowledge is power, right?
It really is.
The more we understand these issues, the better chance we have of finding peaceful solutions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of JihadWatch, what are some of the, key things you hope people take away from this?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the importance of critical thinking.
Okay.
Especially when you're engaging with a source like JihadWatch.
Right.
Which has a very specific point of view.
Right. They have an agenda.
It's not about just accepting everything they say as true.
Right.
Or rejecting outright.
It's about taking the information in.
Right.
And thinking critically about it.
Like we keep saying, question everything. Get different perspectives.
Don't be afraid to have those tough conversations.
Yeah, even if they make you uncomfortable.
Exactly, because that's how we learn and grow.
Sure.
And beyond that, I hope this deep dive has shown just how nuanced these issues are.
Right.
Religious extremism, geopolitical conflicts, they're not simple. There are no easy answers.
It's not black and white.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
It is.
Of black and white thinking.
It's so much more complex than that.
It is. It's about embracing those gray areas.
Totally. There's always more to the story.
Always. And that brings me to my final point. As global citizens, I think we have a responsibility to stay informed, to stay engaged, and to use our voices to advocate for peace and understanding and respect.
It's so easy to get caught up in the negativity.
It is.
Especially with all the terrible things happening in the world.
Absolutely. But we can't let that stop us from fighting for what's right.
I love that.
We have to be the change we want to see.
Well said. I think that's a good note to end on.
It is, yeah.
So, on that note, we're going to leave you with this final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If even these small acts of religious intolerance are happening more and more, what does that say about the potential for bigger conflicts?
And what can we do?
Yeah, what can we do as individuals?
How do we stop it?
To prevent those conflicts from happening in the first place.
Exactly.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Wow.
But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
Keep exploring these topics. Keep forming your own opinions.
Stay curious.
Exactly.
And keep an open mind.
And until next time, stay informed, stay engaged.
Absolutely.
And keep asking those tough questions.
The world needs it.